She'd been hiding a heart condition from her own children for almost a year. I found out completely by accident, while fixing her fence. Barbara called me on a Tuesday afternoon, out of nowhere, and asked if I could come fix a section of fence that had blown down in a storm. I hadn't spoken to my ex-mother-in-law in almost 8 months. I said yes, before I'd even finished processing why she'd called me instead of her own son. 6 weeks later, standing in her kitchen, she told me something that broke something open in me I hadn't realized I was still carrying, and something she'd been hiding from her entire family for almost a year. By the time I found out, I wasn't just fixing her fence anymore. I was the only person she trusted to help her tell the truth before it became an emergency. I need to explain some history before that phone call makes any sense. I was married to Laura for 5 years. It ended a little over a year before Barbara called me about the fence, and it ended the way a lot of marriages quietly end. Not through betrayal or some dramatic rupture, just two people who grew in different directions and eventually admitted it out loud instead of pretending otherwise. Laura and I stayed civil, mostly. The careful, functional civility of people who share nothing left to fight over, except the occasional logistics of splitting up a life. Barbara, Laura's mother, had been one of the genuinely good parts of that marriage the whole time it lasted. She was steady in a way her daughter wasn't always. Laura ran hot and impulsive, prone to big emotional swings, while Barbara had a calm, grounded practicality that I'd leaned on more than I probably should have admitted during the harder stretches of the marriage. She taught me how to properly season a cast-iron pan. She was the one who sat with me in the hospital waiting room when my own father had emergency surgery, because Laura had been traveling for work, and Barbara refused to let me sit there alone. She called me her favorite more than once over the years, always half-joking, always in front of Laura's brother Chris, who took the ribbing in stride because everyone understood it was mostly affectionate exaggeration. I remember one Thanksgiving, about 3 years into the marriage, when Laura and I had gotten into a genuinely ugly fight the night before, over something neither of us could even remember clearly a week later, and I'd shown up to her parents' house the next morning braced for an awkward, tense holiday. Barbara had pulled me aside in the kitchen before anyone else was even awake, handed me a cup of coffee, and told me, plainly, that every marriage worth having survives fights like that, and that the ones worth worrying about are the ones where nobody fights at all, because nobody cares enough anymore to bother. I don't know if she remembered saying that. I never forgot it. After the divorce, Barbara and I lost touch almost entirely. The same quiet, unspoken casualty that happens to a lot of in-law relationships once the marriage that created them ends. I saw her exactly once in that first year, at a mutual friend's funeral, both of us exchanging a stiff, awkward hug and a few minutes of surface-level small talk before drifting to opposite sides of the reception. So when my phone rang and it was her number, after 8 months of silence, I genuinely didn't know what to expect. "I hope this isn't strange," Barbara said when I picked up. "I know it's been a while. I have a section of fence down from that storm last week, and Chris is out of town for work, and I don't know a single other person I trust to actually do it right, instead of charging me triple for something simple. I thought of you before I thought of anyone else, and I don't fully know what to make of that, but I'm asking anyway." I told her I'd come by that weekend. I meant it as a simple, decent favor for someone who'd been decent to me for 5 years. Nothing more complicated than that, or so I told myself driving over that Saturday morning. The fence job took most of the afternoon, longer than it should have because we kept stopping to talk. The easy, comfortable conversation I remembered from years earlier, picking back up almost exactly where it had left off, like the 8 months of silence had barely happened at all. She made lemonade. She asked about my job, my life since the divorce, careful not to ask directly about Laura, and I appreciated that carefulness more than I said out loud. At one point, sitting on her back steps taking a break, she asked me how I was actually doing, not the polite version of the question but the real one, and I found myself telling her things I hadn't fully said out loud to anyone since the divorce. How much quieter my apartment felt some nights, how strange it was to build an entirely new routine after 5 years of a shared one, how I sometimes still reached for my phone to text Laura something funny before remembering, mid-motion, that this particular habit no longer had anywhere to go. Barbara listened without offering easy reassurances, which I'd come to appreciate about her over the years. She never rushed to make discomfort disappear. She just let it exist in the room until it had said what it needed to say. Near the end of the afternoon, hammering in the last post, I asked her, half joking, why she hadn't just called a contractor. "Contractors don't sit and talk with you while they work," she said. "And I've missed the talking, if I'm honest. More than I expected to, given everything." I didn't think much of that comment at the time. I filed it away as a nice, slightly wistful thing an older woman might say to fill a quiet afternoon. I had no idea it was actually the first small crack in something much bigger she'd been carrying alone. What started as one favor turned into something that kept happening, almost accidentally, over the following weeks. Barbara called again about 2 weeks later, ostensibly about a leaky faucet, and again about 10 days after that, about a garden bed that needed reworking before the fall planting. Each excuse was legitimate, genuine small maintenance tasks around a house that had gotten harder for a 71-year-old woman living alone to keep up with. But I noticed, by the third visit, that the actual work rarely took more than an hour, while the visits themselves stretched to 3 or 4. I didn't mind. I want to be honest about that. Those Saturday afternoons became something I genuinely looked forward to, a kind of steady, undemanding companionship that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with a specific, familiar comfort I hadn't realized I'd missed since the divorce. Being around someone who'd known me for years, who didn't need me to perform a version of myself, who just wanted the company. I remember one particular Saturday, working on the garden bed, when Barbara told me stories about her own marriage that I'd never heard before, how she and her late husband had almost divorced themselves, decades earlier, before working through a rough patch that had nearly ended things. Everyone assumes older couples who stay together just never struggled, she told me, kneeling beside me in the dirt, sleeves rolled up despite her age. We struggled plenty. We just decided, both of us, that struggling together was still better than the alternative. Not everyone gets to make that choice cleanly. Sometimes the alternative really is better, the way it was for you and Laura. I don't judge either of you for that. I just think people assume there's only one way a relationship is supposed to look like it's working, and that's never been true in my experience. Those kinds of conversations became a regular feature of our visits, Barbara opening up about pieces of her own history I'd never had access to during my marriage to her daughter, treating me, gradually, less like an in-law and more like an actual confidant in his own right. About a month into this pattern, I noticed something else, too. Barbara seemed tired in a way that didn't match her usual energy. She'd sit down more often mid-conversation, catching her breath in a way she brushed off quickly whenever I asked if she was okay. I mentioned it once, gently, and she waved it off with the same brisk, no-nonsense tone she used for most things. "I'm 71, she said. "Everything takes a little more out of me than it used to. Nothing to fuss over." I believed her, mostly because I wanted to, and because pushing further felt like overstepping a line I wasn't sure was mine to cross anymore. 6 weeks after that first fence repair, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, Barbara asked me to come by for what she called just a chat, nothing broken this time. I found her sitting at her kitchen table, a cup of tea gone cold in front of her, an expression on her face I hadn't seen from her before, something careful, deliberate, like she'd been rehearsing whatever she was about to say. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to actually let me finish before you react, because I've been putting this off for almost a year, and I don't think I can put it off any longer." I sat down across from her, bracing for something, some instinct already telling me this wasn't going to be a small confession. "I have a heart condition," she said, "diagnosed almost a year ago. Nothing immediately life-threatening, according to the doctors, but serious enough that it needs monitoring, medication, and eventually probably a procedure I've been putting off scheduling." I felt something cold settle in my chest, hearing that, and underneath it, a sharper realization. The tiredness I'd noticed on our visits, the way she'd catch her breath mid-sentence, hadn't been ordinary aging the way she'd insisted. It had been this, the whole time, carefully managed and hidden behind a brisk dismissal every time I'd asked. "Barbara," I said, "does Laura know? Does Chris?" She shook her head, and I watched something like shame cross her face. "No, neither of them. I've told no one, actually, until right now." "Why not?" I asked, genuinely stunned. "Why would you sit with something like that alone for a year? That's not a small thing to carry by yourself, Barbara. That's not something anyone should have to carry alone, let alone for that long." "Because Laura is going through her own stress right now, a difficult stretch at work, some things with her new relationship I won't get into, and Chris has his own family, his own pressures, and I have spent my entire life being the person who holds everyone else together, instead of the person who needs holding. I don't know how to be that other person. I don't know how to call my children and say I'm scared and I need you, because I've never once let myself be that vulnerable with them, not even when their father died, not even now. So why tell me?" I asked. Why now, after all this time? She was quiet for a long moment, turning her cold teacup slowly between her hands. Because somewhere in the last 6 weeks, without either of us really deciding it, you became the person I felt safe enough to actually say it to. You don't need anything from me. You're not going to fall apart the way I'm afraid Laura would, or feel obligated to rearrange his whole life the way Chris would insist on doing. You just show up, fix what needs fixing, and let me be exactly as strong or as tired as I actually am that day. I didn't realize how much I needed that until you started providing it. I want to be honest about the position that put me in, because it wasn't a comfortable one. I was now carrying knowledge about a serious health condition that Barbara's own children didn't have, and every instinct in me said that was wrong, that Laura and Chris deserved to know, regardless of how much easier it was for Barbara to keep confiding in someone who asked nothing of her in return. I sat with that discomfort for the rest of the evening after she told me, turning it over on the drive home, trying to figure out where my responsibility actually began and ended in a situation this delicate. I wasn't her son. I wasn't even, legally or formally, anything to her anymore beyond a shared history that had technically dissolved over a year earlier. But some quieter, more insistent voice kept telling me that the technicality didn't actually change what I owed her, or what I owed the family she was keeping this from. I need you to tell them, I said, gently but directly, the next time I saw her. I understand why it's easier to tell me. I understand why this feels safer. But Barbara, if something happens and they find out afterward that I knew and didn't push you to tell them, I don't think either of us survives that. And more importantly, they deserve the chance to actually be there for you, the way you've spent your whole life being there for them. I'm scared, she admitted, the first time I'd heard her say those exact words in all the years I'd known her, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I'm scared of what it does to how they see me. I've been the strong one their entire lives. I don't know how to become the person who needs to be taken care of instead, and some part of me would rather manage this quietly, on my own terms, than watch that shift happen in real time in front of them. That shift is going to happen either way, eventually, I said. The only choice you actually have is whether it happens on your terms, with you controlling the conversation, or whether it happens in an emergency room, with them finding out the worst way possible, wondering why you never trusted them enough to say it sooner. She sat with that for a long time before finally nodding, her hands wrapped tightly around her cold teacup. Will you be there? When I tell them. I don't think I can do it alone, and you're the only person who already knows enough to help me get through it without falling apart halfway through. I agreed, though I understood exactly how strange, and how risky, my presence at that conversation was going to look to Laura and Chris, given the specific shape of what our relationship to each other technically still was. I spent the following week bracing for a conversation I had no real authority to be part of, and no clean way to explain my presence in without it sounding, at best, strange, and at worst, suspicious. I spent a lot of that week turning the whole situation over in my head, trying to understand my own motives as clearly as I could, before walking into a room where everyone else was going to be questioning them. I wasn't doing this out of some lingering hope of reconciling with Laura. That door had closed cleanly, and neither of us had any interest in reopening it. I wasn't doing it for any kind of credit or recognition either. If anything, I understood that showing up to that conversation was more likely to make me look presumptuous than admirable, to a family that had every reason to wonder why an ex-son-in-law had suddenly inserted himself into their most private medical crisis. The clearest answer I could find, turning it over those 7 days, was simpler than I expected, Barbara had asked, and I couldn't find a version of saying no that didn't feel like abandoning someone at the exact moment she'd finally worked up the courage to stop carrying something alone. Whatever confusion or suspicion that decision generated from the rest of the family felt like a fair price for not leaving her to face that room by herself. We arranged the conversation for the following weekend. Barbara's kitchen table. All 4 of us, Barbara, Laura, Chris, and me. An arrangement that felt immediately, visibly strange the moment Laura walked in and saw me already sitting there. "What's going on?" Laura asked, her eyes moving between her mother and me with obvious confusion, an edge of something sharper underneath it. "Why is he here?" "Because I asked him to be," Barbara said. "Please sit. Both of you. I have something to tell you, and I need you to let me get through it before you react." I watched Laura's face while her mother explained the diagnosis, the year of silence, the reasons behind it, watched confusion shift into fear, then into something that looked uncomfortably close to hurt, a specific, personal hurt that went beyond just the medical news itself. Chris's reaction was quieter but no less visible, his jaw tightening, hands gripping the edge of the table, the particular stillness of someone working hard to keep from reacting until they had all the information. "A year," Laura said, once Barbara finished. "You've known for a year, and you told him." She looked at me, and I felt the full weight of that look land somewhere I wasn't prepared for. "You told my ex-husband before you told your own daughter." "Laura," I started. "No," she said, sharper now, standing up from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I need to understand this. What exactly have you two been doing these past 6 weeks? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my mother has been confiding a serious health crisis to my ex-husband instead of me. And I don't understand how that happened, or what that actually means. Do you have any idea how that feels? To find out my own mother trusted someone who isn't even family anymore before she trusted me? I understand why that hurts," I said carefully. "I do. But I need you to know I never went looking for this. Your mom called me about a fence, and somewhere along the way, she started trusting me with something she wasn't ready to say to either of you yet. I told her more than once that she needed to tell you both directly. That's actually why we're all sitting here right now." Chris, quieter than his sister, sat with his arms crossed, watching the whole exchange with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between concern for his mother and open suspicion of me. "It's not what it looks like," Barbara said, before I could answer further. "This isn't about him replacing either of you. This is about me being a coward for an entire year, about admitting I was scared, and finding it easier to say that to someone who wasn't going to rearrange his whole world around my fear the way I knew both of you would. That's not a reflection of him being better than either of you. It's a reflection of me being broken in a way I've never fully dealt with, about needing people versus taking care of them." The room went quiet after that, the specific heavy silence that follows a difficult truth finally being said out loud. Laura sat back down slowly, some of the sharpness draining out of her posture, replaced by something that looked more like exhaustion. Chris uncrossed his arms, finally, and reached over to take his mother's hand across the table, the first physical gesture of comfort either sibling had offered since walking in. "I need a minute," Laura said quietly, standing again, this time without the earlier anger behind it. She stepped out onto the back porch, and after a moment, Barbara moved to follow her, but Chris gently stopped her. "Let me," he said, and went out after his sister instead, leaving Barbara and me alone at the kitchen table for a few minutes, the first real breath either of us had taken since the conversation began. "That went better than I expected, and worse than I hoped," Barbara said quietly, staring at her hands. "Is that normal, for something like this to be both at once?" "I think that's probably exactly normal," I said. "I don't think there's a version of this conversation that doesn't hurt a little on the way to getting better." Chris caught me alone in the driveway afterward, as I was leaving to give the family space to actually process everything together. "I need to ask you something directly," he said. "What are you actually doing here? You're not married to my sister anymore. You have no obligation to any of us. So why have you spent 6 weeks becoming my mother's closest confidant on something this serious, instead of just fixing a fence and going home?" I understood the suspicion. From the outside, I knew exactly how this looked, like I was inserting myself into a family I no longer technically belonged to, for reasons that weren't entirely clear even to me. "Honestly," I said, "I didn't plan for any of this. I came to fix a fence because your mom asked, and I said yes, because she was kind to me for 5 years, and I never got the chance to properly thank her for that before the divorce made everything complicated. The rest just happened, gradually, in ways neither of us fully planned. I'm not trying to take anything from you or Laura. I'm trying to help her do the thing she couldn't figure out how to do alone, which was tell you both the truth before it became an emergency instead of a choice." Chris studied me for a long moment, arms still crossed, clearly turning something over. "She really called you her favorite, all those years. I used to think it was just a bit, something she said to needle me. I'm starting to wonder if she meant it more than any of us realized." "I think she loves all of you the same," I said. "I think what she actually meant when she said that was that I never needed anything from her the way a son or a daughter naturally does. That's not better, it's just different. And it made it easier for her to be honest with me about being scared, because I wasn't going to need her to also manage my reaction to her fear on top of everything else." "That's a generous read," Chris said, not quite convinced yet. "I still don't fully understand why it had to be you specifically." "I don't fully understand it either, if I'm honest," I said. "I think sometimes people end up trusting whoever happens to be standing there, consistently, without an agenda, at exactly the moment they finally need to say something out loud. I just happen to be the one standing there. I don't think that makes me special. I think it makes me lucky, in a strange way, to have been given the chance to actually help. Chris didn't say much else that night, but a few weeks later, once the initial shock had settled and Barbara had scheduled the procedure she'd been avoiding, he called me directly, unprompted, and thanked me, genuinely, if a little stiffly, for pushing his mother toward honesty instead of letting her carry the secret alone indefinitely. "I want to tell you something I probably should have said the night in the driveway," he said, over the phone, his voice carrying a kind of awkward sincerity that told me the call had taken him some effort to make. "I've spent the last few weeks thinking about how I would have handled it if Mom had called me first instead of you. And honestly, I don't know that I would have handled it any better. I think I would have panicked. I think I would have tried to fix it immediately. Probably annoyed her with a dozen phone calls to specialists before she was ready for any of that. Because that's how I cope with things I can't control. You just let her get there on her own timeline. I don't know if I have that kind of patience in me, if I'm honest, and I think that's actually what she needed more than anything else. I think you're being harder on yourself than you need to be," I said. "You would have shown up, in your own way. Maybe not the exact way I did, but you would have shown up." "Maybe," he said. "I appreciate you saying that, either way." Barbara's procedure happened about 6 weeks after that kitchen table conversation. A serious but ultimately low-risk cardiac intervention that the doctors were confident would significantly improve her long-term outlook. The entire family was there that day. Laura, Chris, Chris's wife, and, at Barbara's specific request, me. The morning of the procedure, we all gathered in the pre-op waiting area, the specific sterile hush of a hospital corridor settling over all of us differently. Laura sat close to her mother's gurney, holding her hand, saying little. Chris paced near the window, checking his phone every few minutes for no clear reason beyond needing something to do with his hands. I stood near the back, unsure of my place in the room, until Barbara caught my eye and gestured me closer. "You don't have to hide by the door," she said, managing a small, tired smile despite the circumstances. "You're allowed to actually be here." I remember sitting in that waiting room, much the way Barbara had once sat with me during my own father's emergency surgery years earlier, and thinking about how strange and circular this whole situation had become. How a simple fence repair had somehow led me back into the middle of this family's most vulnerable moment, in a role that had no clean name, no formal title, nothing except the fact that Barbara had trusted me enough to ask, and everyone else had eventually come around to accepting that trust instead of questioning it. The hours in that waiting room stretched long, the way hospital hours always do, all of us cycling through nervous small talk and long stretches of silence, the vending machine coffee going cold in paper cups nobody quite finished. At one point, Laura sat down beside me, unprompted, and we didn't say much of anything, just sat together in the particular kind of quiet that only makes sense between two people who've weathered enough of each other's history to not need words to fill every gap. Chris's wife, who I'd met only a handful of times during the marriage, brought around a tray of coffee for everyone at one point, and paused next to me long enough to say, quietly, "Barbara talks about you a lot more than I think you realize. I'm glad you're here." It was a small thing, a passing comment in a stressful morning, but it stayed with me longer than I expected, a sign that whatever strange, undefined place I now occupied in this family's life had been accepted, at least by some of them, more fully than I'd let myself believe. The surgeon came out almost 4 hours later, and I watched the entire family collectively hold its breath in the particular way only a hospital waiting room produces, before he delivered the news that the procedure had gone exactly as planned, no complications, recovery expected to proceed smoothly. Laura cried, finally, the tears she'd apparently been holding back all morning. Chris hugged his wife, then, somewhat unexpectedly, hugged me too, brief and stiff but genuine. The procedure went well. Barbara came through it strong, recovery ahead of schedule, the specific brisk, no-nonsense energy I'd always known from her returning within days. Laura found me in the hospital cafeteria that first evening, both of us there separately, both needing coffee and a break from the sterile waiting room air. "I owe you an apology," she said, sitting down across from me without asking. "That day at Mom's kitchen table, I said some things I shouldn't have. I was scared and hurt, and I took it out on you because you were the easiest target in the room. You don't owe me anything," I said. "I understood why it looked the way it looked. I probably would have reacted the same way in your position." "I've been thinking about what Mom said," Laura continued, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands, a habit I recognized immediately as one she'd picked up from her mother, without either of them probably noticing. About needing someone who wasn't going to need anything back from her. I think I understand it better now than I did that day. I think some part of me has always needed her to be the strong one, and some part of her has always let me need that, because it was easier than admitting she had limits too. I don't think that's your fault, or even really her fault. I think it's just what happens sometimes in families, and it took an outsider, an ex-outsider I guess, to finally break the pattern. For what it's worth, I said, I don't think it makes you a bad daughter that she didn't tell you. I think it makes her a mother who spent her whole life not knowing how to ask for help, and that's a harder thing to unlearn than either of you probably realize. Chris said something similar, she said. I think we've both been sitting with the same realization this week, honestly, that we maybe let her be stronger than she actually was for longer than we should have, because it was convenient for us too. Nobody wants to think their parent has limits. It's easier to just assume she'll always be the one holding everything together. We sat there for a while longer, the conversation drifting eventually into easier territory. Her mother's prognosis, the logistics of the coming weeks of recovery, small updates about people we'd both once known during the marriage. It was the longest, most honest conversation Laura and I had had since the divorce, and I remember leaving that cafeteria feeling something I hadn't expected to feel again with her, a kind of uncomplicated warmth, no longer tangled up in the specific grief of what our marriage had failed to become. It's been almost a year since that first phone call about the fence. Barbara is doing well. Regular checkups, medication managed, back to her usual brisk energy, though I notice she lets herself rest now in a way she didn't before, no longer performing an endurance she doesn't actually have. My relationship with the family has settled into something I genuinely didn't expect to still have, given how the divorce initially ended things. I'm not romantically involved with anyone from that family. I want to be clear about that, because I know exactly what kind of story this could have become, and it isn't that story. What it actually became is something rarer and, in its own way, more valuable. An ex-son-in-law who somehow remained family, not through any legal or romantic tie, but through the simple, accumulated weight of consistently showing up when it mattered. Laura and I are on genuinely good terms now, better than we were even during the last year of our actual marriage, both of us having found, unexpectedly, a kind of honesty with each other that the marriage itself never quite managed. We grab coffee occasionally, mostly to talk about her mother's recovery, though those conversations have started drifting into other territory too. Old inside jokes resurfacing, easy laughter that surprised us both the first few times it happened. Neither of us has any interest in reconciling romantically. That chapter closed cleanly, and neither of us wants to reopen it. But something adjacent to real friendship has grown in its place. Something I don't think either of us expected the divorce to eventually make room for. Chris and I get a beer sometimes now, an odd, low-key friendship that grew out of that tense driveway conversation into something neither of us would have predicted a year ago. He told me recently, half joking, that he used to resent how easily his mother opened up to me, and that he's since realized the resentment was never really about me at all. It was about his own difficulty being vulnerable with her, something my involvement had accidentally forced him to confront in himself. Barbara still calls me for the occasional fence repair, faucet leak, or garden project, though we both know by now those calls are rarely really about the task itself. Last month, at a small family barbecue I was invited to almost as a matter of course, she introduced me to a new neighbor as my favorite, the same old half-joke from years earlier, except this time Chris, standing right beside her, just laughed and said, "Honestly, at this point, I think she means it." She pulled me aside near the end of that barbecue, once most of the guests had drifted toward their cars, and told me something I've held on to since. "I spent so many years thinking strength meant never needing anyone," she said. "I'm 72 now, and I've finally learned that real strength was always the other thing, letting people in close enough to actually help, even when it terrifies you more than the thing you're facing. You taught me that, without either of us really planning for it to happen that way. I don't know how to thank you properly for that." "You already did," I told her. "The fence was thanks enough. Everything since has just been a bonus neither of us saw coming." I think about that first phone call often, how close I came to letting 8 months of silence become permanent, how easily I could have made an excuse, let someone else handle the fence, kept the clean, simple distance divorce is supposed to create between people who are no longer legally bound to each other. I'm endlessly grateful I said yes instead. I think, too, about the specific weight of the year Barbara spent carrying her diagnosis alone, and what it actually took to move her from that isolation toward letting her children back in. It wasn't a single conversation. It was 6 weeks of small, unglamorous visits, a lot of quiet trust built slowly, and one difficult, necessary push from someone outside the immediate family dynamic who could see the pattern clearly enough to name it. I don't think that role required me specifically. I think it required someone willing to occupy an uncomfortable, undefined space, long enough for the truth to finally have somewhere safe to land. I've thought, more than once, about what might have happened if I'd never gotten that call. If Barbara had kept managing her diagnosis alone indefinitely, quietly scheduling and rescheduling a procedure she was too afraid to face without support, until eventually the condition forced its own emergency, and the family found out the hardest possible way. I don't say that to take credit for preventing some worst-case outcome that may or may not have happened anyway. I say it because it's changed how I think about the small, seemingly unimportant favors people ask of each other. How a fence repair, on paper the most minor of requests, turned out to be carrying something far heavier underneath it, waiting for the right, patient, undemanding presence to finally let it surface. If there's one thing I've taken from all of this, it's that family doesn't always dissolve as cleanly as a legal document suggests it should. Sometimes the people who matter most stay woven into your life in shapes nobody has a proper name for. Not an ex, not quite family, something in between that turns out to matter just as much as either. Barbara didn't need a son-in-law that Tuesday afternoon. She needed someone steady enough to hold a fear she couldn't say out loud to the people closest to her. And it turned out, against every expectation either of us had, that the someone she trusted with that was me. If this one got you, tell me in the comments. And if you want more real stories like this, subscribe. There's a new one waiting for you every week.